Nobody warns you about the specific loneliness of being a competent woman. They warn you about crime. They warn you about the heat. They warn you about scams targeting foreigners, about the language barrier, about the food and the water and the traffic that operates by rules no traffic school has ever codified. People who have never been to the Philippines will warn you about the Philippines with the confidence of people who read one article in 2009 and consider themselves briefed. But nobody warned me about the loneliness of being a woman who has spent 40 years being needed by everyone and then woke up one Tuesday morning and found that nobody needed her anymore. Not urgently, not daily, not in the way that gives a day its shape. That's the loneliness that put me on the plane, not the Philippines part, the Tuesday morning part. But let me back up, because nothing makes sense if I drop you into the middle. My name is Carol. I taught nursing at a community college in Central Ohio for 22 years after spending 16 years before that as an ER nurse in a hospital that was always understaffed and never boring. 38 years total in healthcare, in one form or another. 38 years of being the person in the room who knew what to do, who assessed the situation, identified the problem, administered the solution, and moved to the next one. I was good at it. I want to say that without apology, because women of my generation were taught to qualify every statement of competence with 3 statements of humility, and I am 64 years old, and I am done qualifying. I was married for 11 years to a man named Dennis who was kind and funny and ultimately more interested in his own freedom than in the particular constraints of a shared life, and we parted in a way that was sad but not bitter, and which I have come to think of as the right outcome arrived at by the wrong route. We had no children, which was not a choice either of us made deliberately, and which I have made peace with in the way you make peace with the things that were decided by biology rather than by you. I have a sister in Portland. I have friends who are scattered. I have a niece who sends memes and means well. And I have had the job. The job was the architecture of my life. The job was what told me what time to get up and where to go and what I was for. I retired in May, and by August I understood, with the clinical clarity of a woman trained to diagnose things accurately, that I was in trouble. Not financial trouble. The pension was adequate, the Social Security added to it, the savings were modest but real. Financial trouble would have been manageable. Financial trouble has solutions. What I had was purpose trouble. And purpose trouble, in my experience both personal and professional, is the kind that hollows a person out quietly from the inside while the outside continues to look perfectly fine. I knew the research. 38 years in healthcare means you know the research on social isolation in older adults. You have taught it, you have watched it happen to patients, you understand that loneliness in later life is not a mood, but a medical condition with measurable outcomes, and that a competent woman living alone in an Ohio house with a pension and adequate savings and nothing that requires her presence is not retirement. It is a slow emergency with good lighting. The Philippines came from a student, a former student, a young Filipino-American woman named Paz, who had been one of my best nursing students 8 years before, and who stayed in loose contact the way good students sometimes do with teachers who mattered to them. She sent me an article about older Americans who had gone to the Philippines and found, unexpectedly, the thing they hadn't known they were missing. She sent it with a note that said, "Miss Carol, I don't know if this is relevant, but I thought of you." I read it 3 times. I spent 2 months reading everything I could find. Forums, blogs, Facebook groups, the Retirement Authority websites, the healthcare cost comparisons. I read with the systematic attention of a nurse reviewing a patient chart, looking for the information that would confirm or deny a hypothesis I had not quite let myself state out loud yet. The hypothesis being that the life I needed was not in Ohio, that it was somewhere smaller and warmer and full of people who had not yet learned to treat women my age as furniture. I booked a one-way ticket to Cebu in October. One way because a return ticket is permission to give up, and I had spent too many years in an emergency room giving people permission to quit on themselves to do that to myself. My sister called it brave. My colleague Janet called it insane, which she meant as a compliment. My neighbor's husband, who was not asked, called it risky, in the tone men use when they mean a woman alone shouldn't. I have thought about that man's face several times since, from my porch in the Philippines, in a way that gives me quiet satisfaction. I flew into Cebu and took a small ferry to an island called Negros, specifically a city called Dumaguete, which people told me was manageable, which was the word I needed. Not exciting, manageable. A university city, English-speaking, small enough to walk, large enough to have a proper market, and a cardiologist and a bookshop, and a long seawall called the Boulevard, where the whole city walked at dusk, and which showed up in every photograph with the same reliable beauty. I arrived in the early evening. October heat in the Philippines is the kind that has no interest in your opinion of it. It simply is, completely and without apology, and you adjust to it or you don't. And if you don't, that's useful information about whether you were right to come. I adjusted within the first 10 minutes, in the way that nurses adjust to conditions, by taking an inventory of what was manageable and setting aside what was not. What was not manageable, immediately, was the smell. Not unpleasant. The opposite. It was layered, complex, something flowering over something cooking, over the salt and diesel smell of a port city that has been a port city for centuries. And underneath all of it, something I could not identify and eventually stopped trying to, just accepted as the smell of the place, the specific atmospheric signature of an island I had never been to, and which was about to become mine. A woman named Ate Gloria was waiting at the port. She ran a small guest house near the university that a forum contact had recommended. She was perhaps 60, with reading glasses on a cord, and the expression of a woman who has received many uncertain arrivals and knows exactly what they need, which is not information or reassurance, but a room that is clean and cool, and the knowledge that dinner is handled. She looked at me the way that certain women look at each other when they are both old enough to have stopped performing and young enough to still be interested. She said, "You travel alone, not a question." I said yes. She said, "Good. Alone is easy here. People will find you." Then she took the heavier of my 2 bags without asking and started walking, and I followed. She was right. And that is the first truth nobody warned me about. In America, a woman alone is a condition requiring explanation. Here it was simply a fact about me, no more remarkable than my height or the color of my shoes, and the response to it was not concern or pity or the mild social pressure that American life applies to women who have not organized themselves around another person. The response was practical. Alone means there is room for people to come in, so they do. The guest house had 6 rooms and 3 other guests the week I arrived. A retired Australian teacher named Margot, who had been coming for 3 months every year for 6 years, and who served, in those first days, as my most useful source of actual information, the kind that doesn't appear in forums because it is too specific and too lived. She told me which market stalls had the freshest fish. She told me how to negotiate a tricycle fare without being rude about it. She told me that the boulevard was best at 5:30 when the light came in sideways off the water and the mountains behind the city turned a particular shade of blue that she had not found words for in 6 years of looking. She also told me, on the 3rd evening over San Miguel beers on the guest house porch, that the hardest part was not any of the things I was worried about. I asked what the hardest part was. She said, receiving. I didn't understand her yet. I would. Let me tell you about the first weeks. Honestly, because I made assumptions that a nurse should have known better than to make. I assumed my competence would translate. 38 years of navigating complex systems, of communicating across language and culture, and the particular communication challenges of people in physical distress, I assumed this would serve me here. And it did, eventually. But first it got in my way. Because competence in a system you know is a resource. Competence performing itself in a system you don't know yet is just noise. I managed situations that didn't require management. I explained things that didn't need explaining. I problem-solved out loud in a culture where the problem-solving happens quietly, laterally, through relationships and mutual understanding, rather than through stated plans. I was efficient in a place that had decided efficiency was not the highest value and had good reasons for that decision. It took me 6 weeks to stop performing competence and start paying attention. That is when the place began to make sense. The woman who taught me the most in those early weeks was not someone I sought out for instruction. Her name was Nena. She ran the small eatery 2 streets from the guest house where I ate breakfast every morning, a tiny room with 4 tables and a kitchen behind a counter and a chalkboard menu that changed daily. She was perhaps 70, slight, with hands that moved over a kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had cooked the same things for 50 years and had arrived at the motions that wasted nothing. She fed me arroz caldo my first morning, the rice porridge, ginger warm and deep, a bowl of it that was both breakfast and instruction in how this country treats the beginning of a day. Not quickly, not minimally, with intention. I tried to tell her it was wonderful. My Cebuano was non-existent then. I pointed at the bowl and put my hand over my heart, which is the gesture of a person with no words attempting sincerity. Nena looked at my hand on my heart, and then looked at my face, and then did something I was not expecting. She laughed. Not at me, with me, before I was laughing, pulling me into the laugh by the certainty that I would arrive there if she started without me. Then she refilled the bowl without asking. The second truth nobody warned me about is this. Being cared for, after a lifetime of being the one who does the caring, is not comfortable. It is not the relief you imagine it will be. It is, at first, deeply uncomfortable in a way I was not prepared for, and which I want to name plainly, because I think it is true of many women who come from the professions of caring and have confused giving care with being a person of value, and therefore experience receiving it as a kind of demotion. Nena refilling that bowl without asking was a small act. I know that. But it located something in me that had been lost and I didn't know was lost. The something being the knowledge that I could be on the receiving end of attention, and it didn't mean I had failed at self-sufficiency. It just meant someone had noticed me and acted on the noticing. And that is not weakness. That is the basic transaction of being human. I cried in my room that evening. I want to say that plainly, because this story is not the version where a competent woman holds it together throughout. I cried in the way that I had not cried since I was new to the ER and had not yet built the clinical distance that protects you from taking everything home. The way you cry when something cracks open that you had sealed shut without realizing you'd sealed it. I had been sealed shut for a long time. I moved into a proper apartment at the end of the 2nd month. Found it through Margot, who found it through the woman who sold her vegetables at the market, which is how things are found in that city, not through listings, but through the network that runs beneath the surface of the place, the web of who knows who and what is available and what this particular person might need. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a small concrete building in a neighborhood called Bantayan, 1 street back from the boulevard. 2 rooms, a kitchen, a little balcony looking onto a courtyard where a banana tree stood with the authority of something that had been there longer than the building. 8,000 pesos a month. Call it $140. I stared at that number for a long time the first time I wrote the check. The building had 3 other units. Below me, a young couple, newlyweds, who cooked elaborate Sunday dinners, the smell of which came up through my floor like an invitation. Beside them, a family, the Reyes family, with two teenage girls who studied at the university, and across the small hall from my door, an older woman named Aline Coring. Aline Coring was 68, a retired schoolteacher. She had a daughter in Cebu and a son in Riyadh who sent money every month and called when he could, and whose absence she did not discuss, but which was present in the particular way that an absent child is always present in a mother's house, in the photographs and the objects kept carefully, and the phone held a certain way during calls. She had silver hair she wore pinned up with a patience that I recognized as the patience of women who have stopped doing things for appearance and do them now for themselves. She had, I learned over weeks, opinions about everything, delivered in the direct way of someone who had spent 40 years shaping young minds and saw no reason to stop being useful. She knocked on my door the third morning after I moved in with a container of something she said was para lang, just because, which I learned is the Filipino equivalent of the untranslatable gesture of feeding someone because you made enough and they exist. It was pinakbet, a vegetable stew with bitter melon and squash and long beans and shrimp paste, and it was the most honest meal I had eaten in years. Honest in the sense of being exactly what it was, nothing performing itself as something else. I thanked her in my developing Cebuano. She corrected my pronunciation without ceremony, the way a teacher corrects, because correcting is caring, and she had not learned to distinguish the two, and she left. She came back the next day with more, and the day after, and I began to understand, slowly, that this was not charity. It was not pity for the lone foreign woman in the upstairs unit. It was the community in operation. It was the web doing what the web does, which is to pull the loose threads toward the center, to incorporate without asking permission, to decide that a person in proximity is a person worth knowing, and to act on that decision through the most direct channel available, which is food. Aline Coring became the first real friend I made in the Philippines. We are a study in how friendship works when two stubborn, competent women of a certain age find each other in a small building and discover they are the same loneliness coming from opposite directions. She had lost her husband 12 years before. I had never fully had one. She had given 40 years to other people's children. So had I, in a different way. She was trying, in retirement, to figure out who she was without a classroom. I was trying to figure out who I was without an emergency room. We figured it out mostly on her balcony in the evenings, with coffee she made strong enough to require respect, talking in our mixed language of her careful English and my improving Cebuano and the gestural vocabulary that develops between